Next, we'd like to welcome Pat English up to continue on with the follow-through on drug testing.
I've known Margaret for probably, I'm not supposed to see. You should see her. No. All right. I've known her for a long time. Since she was 3. And she certainly knows how to provoke. Because the first thing she said is, well, maybe if there's going to be any diminution of drug testing, use swimming. Now, what was wrong with that statement, Margaret? So, you may not have heard her. My daughter was on the U.S. national team for a number of years, and wrong sport to pick. Anyway, this talk that I'm about to give is really not for Nevada, and it's not for California. Because it's about what happens after you receive notification of a positive drug test. And there's some other states that have dealt with this quite a bit. New Jersey is one. But many states have not dealt with it in any kind of depth. And really, the purpose of what I'm about to say, and I don't have any PowerPoints, so you're going to have to just look at me, which is unfortunate, is to talk about how you handle the unthinkable. You get a report of a positive drug test from your own testing, from VADA, or from USADA, or some other third-party group. There's others out there, which are less credible in my mind. But they will sometimes come forth with the results. Well, you've got to separate the categories from pre-fight and post-fight. Now, you've heard a lot about the Francisco Vargas situation. I think the best way to handle discussion of pre-fight is to talk about 3 different instances. And I'm going to talk about the way certain things were handled. Some of the people are here. Don't throw eggs at me, and don't throw tomatoes or glasses or whatever it may be. But I'd like to contrast the way the Francisco Vargas matter was handled with a matter that happened some time ago, which involved a fighter named Eric Morales, and the current situation involving Povetkin and Wilder, with Povetkin showing signs of melodeum. You've heard the facts regarding Vargas. One of the things that the California Commission did, I think totally correctly, and I'm looking for Andy. I don't know where he is. Raise your hand, Andy. Oh, he's out. He's smart. Everything was extremely open. There could be no question that both sides were involved. He indicated that one of the first things he did was to contact the Salido side. The press was advised. It was advised as to the process, and everything was done openly. It is not true that every time somebody has a positive or questionable test, and there are tests that are questionable, that a fight should automatically be canceled. Andy was faced with 2 choices: cancel the test, cancel the fight rather, or be given the time frame, make sure that any substance was out of his system, clenbuterol, out of his system, and let the fight go forward. Either one would have been an acceptable result, but the fact that he did it openly, so that both sides knew exactly what was going on at every step, and indeed the press knew public knew what was going on at every step, created a situation where I didn't read one bit of criticism of him or of the commission in allowing that fight to go forward, which is quite unique in my experience. That situation, indeed, given the lead time, is quite unique. Let me contrast that with another situation involving Eric Morales. There's some dispute, factual dispute, but a couple of days before he was to fight at Madison Square Garden against Danny Garcia, he also came back with a pre-fight test that was positive. The result was not conveyed, to my knowledge, to the Danny Garcia side initially. It was not discussed publicly. It was leaked by a really not mainstream web reporter. It eventually circulated its way up to the more mainstream web reporters, and there were a lot of no comments. My opinion is that was done very inappropriately. I don't believe that fight should have gone forward. He had a test which was in reasonably close proximity to the bout. I believe it created a potentially unfair situation. And worse, the amount of criticism of both the New York Athletic Commission and USADA, some of which came from me in terms of USADA, was the testing organization, was immense. The Athletic Commission claimed that they received no guidance, and they received the test results very, very late in the day. It's not public, but I've spoken with Melvina Latham, who was the chairperson at the time, and she was very put upon that the test results did not come to the commission in a timely way. Last year I talked about the fact that there are some contracts out there, and I believe that USADA has done away with this, in fairness to USADA, but there are contracts out there, some of which, old ones, involved USADA, where the local commissions were not informed of positive tests. I'm talking about pre-fight tests. I was recently approached by another party, not USADA, not VADA, obviously, about a contract of that nature, which, of course, we rejected. The Nevada Athletic Commission, by way of an aside, recently enacted regulations which take place, are likely to be effective September, simply prohibiting that, making that illegal. So they have to get results. Actually, their word was immediately. All right, so you got Eric Morales. And then the third one I want to talk about in terms of handling it, which I think has generally been handled well, is the Povetkin-Wilder situation. A complex situation indeed. Mr. Povetkin turned up positive for a substance called melodium. It was commonly used in Russian athletes, and I know that the WBC is grappling with this right now. And at the outset, I've got to say, that was an international fight. It wasn't to take place in the United States. So no commission is handling that. The WBC is handling that dispute. And it's a major dispute if you've read the involving litigation and everything else. Not a whole lot was known about melodium when the test came out positive. It had been used in Russia legally up until January 1st, at which point WADA prohibited it. Felt that it was a performance enhancer. What was not known when they prohibited it was how long it stayed in the system. It turns out it stayed in the system It stays in the system for quite a long period of time. There was an initial guidance document by WADA when the results came out, it was in effect, which said you got to treat these with great caution. We don't know how long it takes to excrete this stuff. We don't know if, based upon certain amounts, which are in the guidance document, we don't know whether it means that the person took it before or after the cutoff. And then subsequently, much more recently, after the test, they came out with an additional guidance document which defines amounts in the system, and the amounts in Povetkin's system were very low indeed. So the WBC is grappling with that. In the lack of information, with the lack of information and immediate determination, I think the WBC did the right thing insofar as it said, you can't go forward with the fight right now. We'll study it and we'll make a ruling. And Mauricio's here. He can correct me if I say anything incorrect, but I'm pretty sure that so far I'm correct. Due process. Obviously, both sides knew of the test in the Povetkin situation. My understanding is, from people who have been involved, that both sides came in to meetings with the WBC and their experts, and I'm going to come to the experts that you might need, and gave their position papers, or their positions. The Wilder side saying this guy is dirty as can be, and the Povetkin side saying, no, I didn't take it after a prohibited date. And I gather that is currently before the WBC, unless a ruling came down today, which I hope you'll tell us about if it did. I am going to go out on a limb, and I have not spoken with Mauricio, but I've seen the WADA guidance documents, which are very significant evidence in terms of this, and I'm not 100% sure that you can convict Povetkin, if that's the right terminology, based upon the WADA scientific guidelines. But there may be other information of which I'm unaware. But the point here is that the WBC handled the matter in a way similar to that which Andy handled it. The difference being no decision could be made quickly because of the very highly technical nature. And they had to get scientific input, which was changing during this entire process. Additional information was coming in based upon scientific studies. So both sides had due process. Whether I think they should have all been in the same hearing, I happen to, but it's not terribly important in terms of both sides being heard. So those are things that occur pre-fight. Most of the time, pre-fight, positive test, 99% of the time, you'll have to cancel the fight based on a positive. Sometimes there's time to do the B sample. 99.9% of the time, that comes out the same. The fight will have to be canceled. You can't allow somebody who is enhanced by virtue of a PED fighting somebody who isn't. It's an unfair situation. And if anybody gets hurt, we heard a little lecture yesterday about liability. I think that is the classic case of liability if you knowingly allow that. So, let's talk a little bit about the more typical situation. Fight's taking place. Sometime after the fight, you get a report from Margaret, from your own testing entity, USADA, so-and-so tested positive. Now, you're all either tribal entities or state agencies. State agencies have to give due process. Otherwise, you will be sued. But you do that. You do that because as state agencies, you're accustomed. And your lawyers, the state lawyers that will represent you in these proceedings, are accustomed to it. My experience with the tribes is that they will do it because it's a matter of fundamental fairness to give people the right to defend themselves. Whether you think they're guilty or not, sometimes they're not. I mean, I think, frankly, the natural conclusion with respect to Povetkin, which we just spoke of, was, oh, he's guilty as sin. But that may not be the case. May not be the case. Sometimes they're more ambiguous things. The Vargas situation, where you're talking about, wasn't quite clear. He had gone down and eaten some beef in Mexico. So you got to hear out what the situation is. The first thing you're going to have to do is contact the attorney that represents the agency, tribal agency or state agency. Now, here is the problem. What I'm about to tell you has to be superseded by whatever the attorney who represents your agency says. And sometimes the attorneys who represent the agency I end up vehemently disagreeing with in terms of their processes. But I'll give you what I think is the right process. First of all, you must immediately, within 24 hours, tell the fighter, and hopefully even sooner, tell the fighter who is charged with having failed the test that he is, in fact, charged with having failed the test, given whatever test results you've got, and bring charges against him, at least to the extent of saying, you know, you're facing a very serious situation here. You have the right to have the B sample tested. Now, nobody's talked about B samples yet, but typically, almost universally, there are two samples taken. The A sample is initially tested, and the B sample is only tested if necessary. The fighter has the right to have the B sample tested. Now, if it's a WADA-certified lab, the chances of the B sample coming out differently are almost non-existent. As close to non-existent as it can possibly be, but they have the right. Some lesser labs, it becomes more important, but they have the right in any case. What I suggest, and sometimes this gets dragged out, and this is not good for anybody, I suggest that in this initial notification, you tell them they have the right to have the B sample tested by notifying you within X days, short period of time, 7 days, 10 days, no more. You got to get the process moving, because we're going to talk about how processes can be delayed and other people get hurt as a result. Okay, so they have the B sample tested. There's a miracle. It's clean. All right, charges go away. That's easy. But the B sample tests positive. Now, how many people here, don't you raise your hand because I know the answer on you, Bob. How many people here have had truly contested hearings on positive drug tests where the fighter claims that he didn't do it? I know you, yes, New Jersey has for sure. Okay. Most of the time when the B sample comes back, the fighter will say, well, I'm not sure how it got there, but it's there and I give up on that. Every so often, and I throw myself on the mercy of the court, which we'll come to in a little bit. But every so often, there's a fighter that says, oh, no, not me, and I can give you a pretty good example. It's quite public. When Mr. Tarver fought Mr. Cunningham, well, twice Mr. Tarver, once in California years ago, tested positive, and recently when he fought Mr. Cunningham, he tested positive, and both times he said, not me, A sample, B sample tested, but not me. I didn't do it. Somebody must be playing around with the samples. So he had a right to a hearing, and he was given a hearing. Now, here is an issue right off the bat. Who knows about the positives? When do other people know about it? There are states, New Jersey among them, which take the position that until the very late in the process, all this is confidential. It's secret. There's been I know that Larry Hazard has been advised by their risk management people, don't let anybody know about it. Well, that is one of the areas where I could not disagree more. There are two people in that ring. There was Steve Cunningham in that ring. It happened to be a draw between Steve Cunningham and Tarver. But there were two people. Steve Cunningham had a right to be heard. It's not only the due process rights of the alleged offending fighter, but it's the rights of the fighter that was offended, arguably, against, that should be aware of what's going on and, be, in my opinion, be allowed to participate if they choose. Now, why should they be allowed to participate? You don't have to really worry about this in Nevada or in New Jersey, although you should, because I happen to know from personal experience that there are both states, while they have widely divergent positions on a lot of things, they both know their drug PED stuff inside and out. But a lot of attorneys don't. Let's assume that this is a high-profile fellow, whether it's MMA or boxing, who comes in with a very knowledgeable attorney who knows drug testing inside and out. Well, trust me, your Deputy Attorney General is not going to know drug testing in and out. I don't know drug testing in and out, and I've been studying it for many years, and I think I know a lot. But a Deputy Attorney General or tribal officer is simply not going to be experienced enough to deal with that type of high-powered attorney. I hate to say that. Anybody can learn anything, but not within the scope of a couple of days. So this is why I say this is not necessary for Nevada or New Jersey or California, but it is necessary for you. If it's a big deal, if it's one of the big fighters who's going to put a lot of resources in it, hire an expert. And I'm not talking about an expert attorney. I'm talking about a scientific expert. I'm going to give you three names. Dr. Don Caitlin used to be with the UCLA, formed the UCLA Olympic Testing Lab. Dr. Butch, who is currently with the UCLA Testing Lab, and Dr. Eichner, who is with the Salt Lake City Smart Lab. They're all top-notch. Used to be Dr. Voy here in Nevada once upon a time. And he may still be up to speed. I'm not 100% sure because, frankly, I've lost just a little bit of touch with him. But you need help because the smoke that will be blown, and I've seen the paperwork. The Tarver is a perfect example. I know the drug testing. Luckily, Nick Lembo and Sherry Wolkin, who advised the commission in New Jersey, they know it too. They know it to a T. Okay. And you will need help to separate what's legitimate and what's not legitimate in terms of the arguments. At least so I believe. And I also believe that the opposing fighter should be allowed to participate. Just remember that there is a general rule that the fighter, whether he knew what was going in his body or not, is generally responsible for whatever is in his body in terms of a PED. That helps the commission. It's a general standard. But you got a penalty phase here too. And it is true, my experience, that sometimes fighters don't know that they've taken something. Used to be the argument was supplements. It still is sometimes. There's no substitute, in my view, for looking the fighter in the eye in assessing his credibility about whether he knew what he was doing or not. Very often, in my experience, trainers are strength trainers, with the latter being more prevalent, that are giving these kids stuff. They get paid based upon how well these kids do, and they want them to do well. One example, Fernando Vargas, not Francisco, Fernando, if you guys have long memories, fought Oscar de la Hoya, right here. He had a concussion. He was sent to the hospital by the commission with no drug test at that time. This is way before people were as sophisticated as they are. He was released from the hospital at about 4 a.m. after being cleared there. He had been told by the commission, well, why don't you stop by a LabCorp place? They didn't specify what LabCorp place. And apparently there's 24-hour LabCorp places where you can give urine. He stopped on his way back to the hotel at 4 a.m., gave the urine, and turned up positive for a steroid. It appeared to me that he must not have known that he had a steroid in his system, because nobody would have criticized him at all for not doing it. He was in the hospital. And nobody was pursuing him from the commission. It just wasn't that type of an issue. I don't remember whether you were the ringside physician at the time or not. Okay, she's nodding yes. Well, there was a full-blown hearing. But I was representing Vargas in that matter. One of the things we had to do was figure out where it came from. It didn't take very long. It turned out that his strength and conditioning trainer was a steroid dealer. And it was pretty obvious that where it came from. But Vargas, I believe to this day, didn't know. Commission made an appropriate punishment, and he served his time and paid his fine, which was substantial because it was a substantial purse. But there are times when the fighter just doesn't know. And you do, I believe, have to look in their eyes. Some people are evasive. There's no substitute for looking at a person and seeing their demeanor. I have an former FBI agent over here nodding, and I bet he's done a lot of interviews in his life. So we've established pretty much that if you're using a good lab, the likelihood of the test result being different in the beast test is infinitesimal. But there's another thing that comes up, and I'm told there's time issues. So I'll be very quick. On numerous occasions now, I have seen the method of taking the test or the chain of custody be deficient. I saw it. I'm representing Felix Sturm in a matter, and I generally don't represent fighters that test positive, but occasionally I do. Usually it's the other way around. But the way that the testing was done didn't comport with proper standards. It was a very unique fight. If you remember the fight, it was the one where the substance, the substance came off the gloves. Both fighters were covered with something. It was red. And there's substantial reason to believe that somebody had done something inappropriate. There may have been something in the Vaseline that was on the gloves, and it caused it to run, and that's where the positive came from. And the testing was not done in accordance with international standards. That's still up in the air. It's not ruled on, but it looks pretty good for Mr. Sturm. And there's been others, situations like that in years past. You got to go right. If you're an attorney and you're looking to challenge, the lab is the least likely, but you've also got to look, and you as adjudicators also have to look at whether the test was taken in a proper way. Next year, when the Abdusalamov case is all done, we'll talk about that, and we'll have the facts, and it's very enlightening on a number of different levels. So that's next year, and I will have for that a PowerPoint presentation because there's lots of pictures. But for now, What questions do I have? Yes, sir. Mr. Peoples.
Outside of fighters participating in Tahoe, we saw a lot of big name fighters. A lot of times, big name fighters are fighting for one of our titles.
Yes.
What I didn't hear is at what point there is an obligation, if any, to sanctioning organizations.
Well, it gets. I started by saying, I hope, that this applies to this body in the United States or Canada. International bodies often have to adjudicate. I know the IBF has. We've spoken about the WBC adjudicating the Povetkin. And you should be following the same standards, in my view. Now, it gets more complicated because of the nature of the testing from overseas, but that is beyond the scope of what I can talk about. If you want to talk to me about that, I'm happy to talk. But I'm having people go, "Klee." Well, you don't have a role, in my view, in the United States because of the jurisdiction of the commissions, which is different here than in Europe. You have a role to monitor carefully and be apprised of everything. But and you would, I've never seen a rating organization do otherwise. If it's adjudicated a guilt and you strip and you take appropriate internal action, but the actual hearings are done by the commissions in the United States. Anyone else? Thank you very much.